And now we have our third contribution from Edward Castleton from Besançon.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this works. Okay. What I have to say is sort of an extension of some of the stuff that Samuel was saying, and I'm not going to read a paper or anything like that. I already wrote too much. So I'm kind of just going to start out some of the issues that my paper attempted to address but didn't, because I was very conscientious about using lots of quotes so that people who aren't familiar with these discussions about Proudhon's legacy and the international could somehow kind of enter into this discussion. So the result is that perhaps it becomes a little bit too much quotation and not enough analysis, which I began my paper doing. But what I'd like to do now is try to attempt to sort of maybe see the forest from the trees with regards to Proudhon's supposed legacy in the First International, and not just talk about the Gravillier, but talk about how Proudhon was used more generally as a reference in these IWMA discussions of the various congresses. And I guess I'd like to begin by making a couple of preliminary remarks designed to perhaps stimulate debate later on. I was sort of surprised yesterday to hear a lot of references to d'histoire en bas, or history from below. And as I was explaining to Gareth, E.P. Thompson is à la mode in France right now, even though in England, in many respects, a lot of what he wrote, apart from the fact he was a brilliant stylist and writer, has been called into question. And I guess what I wanted to say with this Histoire d'en bas is that that's fine to continue the, looking at history from below, but in many ways, we still don't know the Histoire d'en haut. We certainly know with regards to the IWMA, the kind of affaire des personnalités, the quarrels between Bakunin and Marx and so forth. So we superficially are familiar in many respects with the debates which went on and the positions. But in terms of situating those discussions within a larger history of ideas and the circulation of ideas and what that meant in the context of the 1860s and 1870s, I'm not so sure that much progress has been made, which is too bad in many respects, because, the Cold War is over with, and we're in the 21st century, and so we could kind of maybe perhaps approach a lot of these issues with a little bit more objectivity, if that's possible, or at least neutrality. And I guess in bringing up this issue of the larger circulation of ideas in this period of the 1860s and 1870s, I think it's important because a lot of mention was made of globalization yesterday, sort of understood as social history writ large on a planetary scale. But I mean, there also are ideas out there that are being discussed, and it's worth talking about that. And I think that Jean Passon, in his paper on Belgium, didn't mention some of these things that were going on in Belgium with these various congresses on the social sciences and the student congresses. There were also congresses in Belgium about literary and artistic property. And there has been stuff that's been written by historians about, the various congresses which took place in this period of the 1860s, in which there was sort of a European-wide attempt to kind of make sense of the sort of post-1848 or perhaps post-1852 world. So I guess the question of revisiting the history of the IWMA through the lens of intellectual history could be interesting. And these positions are particularly important, as I'd like to say now. I mean, for instance, and I think Gareth's work addresses this too, his current work on Marx, we can see this very easily with Marx and the question of communism. And, what did Marx mean by communism? And in many respects, Marx, towards the end of his life, towards the last, 12, 15 years of his life, however long he lived after finishing Capital, became interested in studying property relations and, in many respects, was interested in the same sorts of issues which interested a lot of his contemporaries, such as Herzen and Bakunin, or in Belgium somebody like Lavallee, or all the German scholarship which rose around Maurer, and also you find people like César de Pape addressing in a very different way the question of collective property. So there is, despite these seeming ideological differences among all of these contemporaries, sort of a shared set of preoccupations, which is perhaps worth examining. And now I chose in my paper to address the issue of property and how property was discussed within the IWMA with regards to Proudhon, partly because if you look at the 4 volumes of the Fremont et al. Edition of the various discussions in the IWMA, most references to Proudhon are made with regards to property. And notably, with this seeming contradiction between Proudhon's early position on property, in which he says that property is theft, and his later position on property, in which he seems supportive of individual property. And so there's this kind of controversy within the IWMA, and it's not a controversy that is put forth by the Gravillier. Most references to Proudhon are made by Belgians and by César de Pape, who actually knows Proudhon very well, because when he was a typographer, he edited Proudhon's work, and he was initially kind of taken by Proudhon and seduced by him the same way that Proudhon, when he was a typographer in Besançon, was seduced by Fourier. Before then, he shook himself of the intellectual yoke of Fourier's influence as much as de Pape through the writings of Colloque, and then Marx was able to free himself from Proudhon to come up with something different, a more eclectic synthesis. I think with regards to this whole issue of the ideological baggage of talking about the ideas vehicled in the First International, I just would like, by way of anecdote, to mention an experience I had recently, in which I was invited to an anarchist conference. It's Saint-Imier, which, as we all know here, I hope, Saint-Imier is a very important place in the history of the IWMA, because it's where the kind of counter-congress was held, and Saint-Imier is in Switzerland, for those of you who don't know that, after the Hague Conference, which resulted in the exclusion of Bakunin and James Guillaume. And this Congress, in sort of anarchist hagiography, is considered sort of like this foundational moment within the history of anarchism, where anarchism begins in this small Swiss town, unlikely place. But I think what's interesting about Saint-Imier and this historiography is there's this tendency to think, okay, well, there was this Marx-Bakunin conflict, and then that ended, and for Marxists, then the IWMA ended with the Hague Congress. And then there's Saint-Imier, this Declaration of Independence, and then we don't have to talk about the rest. Of course, there are a lot of congresses between 1872 and 1877 in the IWMA, if we want to consider these Federalist Congresses to be the sort of extension of what the IWMA was originally about. And that is a problem for anarchists, because in many respects, it's at the very moment that the anti-authorian opposition to the General Council comes out more and more as anarchist that the IWMA collapses. So one could maybe even make the argument that the IWMA didn't end with the moving the General Council to New York, but in fact ended when anarchists became anarchists. So that was a point that was brought up at this anarchist conference that I attended, and which did not please contemporary militants very much, because it seemed to go against the grain of this sort of heroic narrative of martyrdom. So I guess by mentioning this, it's not for no reason whatsoever to passer de coq à l'âne, but just to suggest that it's perhaps necessary to jettison a lot of the presuppositions that we've had about the sort of ideological debates and stakes which were going on. So, for instance, so much of the literature on Bakunin, if we look at the Œuvre complète de Bakunin, it typically deals with the Bakunin of the 1870s. The Lening edition is like that. The Guillaume Netlau edition, it's sort of 1868, 69 to the end. We're very much seeing Bakunin through the lens of this struggle with Marx. and in which, particularly later on in 20th century historiography, Bakunin is presented as some sort of critic of the bureaucratization which is necessarily inherent to Marxism, the adjective, or the school of thought, to Marxism, and also the Soviet Union. So this idea that Bakunin somehow foresaw all of what was going to happen with the practical experience of communism, I mean, this is totally risible and does not help us understand Bakunin, or, for that matter, Marx. And so, that said, perhaps it's time to just jettison altogether as well all of these various etiquettes, which was suggested yesterday in the paper about Cafiero, Marxist, Proudhonian, Bakunist, etc. And in the opening of my paper, I mentioned this quote by a Blanquist named Gustave Proudhon, Blanquist in quotations, I say, because as I was saying, Michel Cordier was saying to me, even Blanquists, in spite of their conspiratorial mentality of all those people who like Blanqui, that might be a difficult adjective to use too, so I forgive myself for using it in my paper. I will never do it again. Gustave Proudhon said, he quoted, he attributed to Proudhon probably a apocryphal remark, although who knows, s'il existe des Proudhoniens, et on me l'affirme, ce sont des imbéciles. And this is very much like another apocryphal remark that Engels attributed to Marx in conversation with Paul Lafargue. And I didn't have the English quote and was too lazy to look it up in English. But in French, it's ce qu'il y a de certain, c'est que moi, je ne suis pas marxiste. So, that said, the starting point for what I wanted to write about was rather than, okay, let's look at the Proudhonians as they've been described in typical historiography about the IWMA, where there's this first phase, which is Proudhonian, followed by the collectivist phase, followed by the Marx-Bakunin phase, followed by the decline and fall, whatever, sectarian squabbling that was left over after the Hague Congress. Let's look at who Proudhonians were who actually knew Proudhon and who were friends with him, and who wrote stuff about politics, economics, and so forth. And of those Proudhonians who are friends with Proudhon, who wrote a lot about contemporary issues, there are more or less three that are important, in my opinion. Gustave Chaudet, Jérôme Amédée Langlois, who Samuel didn't mention, but also was part of the IWMA and participated in at least the Basel Congress of 1869. Georges Duchesne, who was a sort of journalist who wrote a lot denouncing stock market speculation and also wrote a number of books, although he wasn't accredited, that are attributed to Proudhon. He basically wrote the Manuel d'un spéculateur à la bourse, and he wrote the Thierry Lampeau de Proudhon. To which I could possibly add a fourth, a sort of apostate friend of Proudhon, whose name was Alfred Darimont, who actually joined the liberal opposition of the Five, or les Cinq, in the Second Empire. And in many respects, the book that Samuel mentioned, De la capacité politique des classes ouvrières, was written not only, as I suggest, against Tolin, which is also another irony, is that this book that's attributed, that's considered Proudhonian because of its impact directly on the Gravilliers section, was written in part initially against Tolin, who Proudhon thought was an idiot, but it was also written against Alfred Darimont, who Proudhon considered to be an apostate to his own beliefs, because they worked together in these newspapers like Langlois and Duchesne in the 1848-1850 period. And Proudhon considered his sort of entering the parliamentary opposition to the empire as a form of treason, because Proudhon's position was that you can't participate in politics under an empire because, you know, that's not a good thing, because that recognizes the legitimacy of the imperial regime. And that's really at the heart of his supposed abstentionism, is this very contingent position with regards to the nature of imperial politics, that you shouldn't participate in them. If it were a republic, however, that would be okay. So it's not a general stance against politics participation in politics altogether, but with politics within an imperial framework. This is an important point, which I will get to in a second. Now, my starting point for this paper, and I will be very quick from here on, is simply this a quote I had found by Gustave Chaudet in a letter to Courbet, in which he refers to his participation in a League of Peace and Freedom conference, which was held right after 5 minutes. Right after the Lausanne IWMA conference in 1868. And Chaudet says, nous avons fait à Berne d'assez bonne besogne. Je me suis trouvé là en lutte corps à corps avec le fameux Bakounine, le révolutionnaire russe, traînant à sa suite tout le camp des collectivistes ou partisans de la propriété collective. C'est un mot nouveau pour désigner cette vieille rengaine du communisme. Ils ont aussi une manière de concevoir l'idée fédéraliste qui, à force de l'étendre et de la faire sortir du concret, le concret, c'est le vrai réalisme. This is an attempt to flatter Courbet for his realism in painting. La réduisent à une pure abstraction, à une chimère, à une généralité insaisissable, à une banalité sentimentale. Nous avons combattu tout cela fort et ferme, et nous avons, par une victoire complète, reconstitué la Ligue de paix sur de sérieuses et fortes bases. So I was intrigued by this quote when I came across it a couple of years ago, because it seemed to suggest that there was this conflict between Bakunin and Chaudet, who actually, as things turned out, wrote a large part of de la capacité politique des classes ouvrières, which is typically considered as this sort of foundational moment, which everyone ascribes an important place in the kind of Proudhonianism of the IWMA. And this would suggest that that sort of typical narrative is a lot of hogwash. So, I quoted at length in my paper this Congress because it's interesting, because it's very hard to come across the bulletin stenographique of this League of Peace and Freedom Congress, which is sort of a peripheral organization, but in which many IWMA members participated, because their congresses were typically held just a few days after IWMA conferences, typically in Switzerland, where a lot of the IWMA conferences were, so a lot of people attended. And I thought it would be interesting to go back over this debate, because it is this debate about collectivism, which was raised in Lausanne and also raised subsequently in Basel, famously. And so, I guess by way of conclusion, there's this, basically, I talked in my paper mainly about Proudhon with regards to this property problem. I suppose one could also talk about Proudhon and the state and electoral politics and how that was discussed in IWMA conferences. This is certainly brought up in César de Pape's paper on the public services, the service public. Did Proudhon really, for instance, want to get rid of the state, or was he imagining the state differently? Were the anarchists too intransigent in their attempts to create a sort of inheritance or intellectual heritage that they could, evoke to somehow ascribe legitimacy to their positions, which were very much inscribed within particular discussions. So I guess there's this reception problem. There's Proudhon's thought, and what did that mean? Are there contradictions within his thought? What is the general evolution of his thought? Or is it a system? I think it would be a mistake to think that anyone's thought is a system, especially revolutionaries whose ideas are constantly evolving in terms of actual events. How do his self-proclaimed disciples appropriate this thought? What is the political context of this appropriation? Well, you have the radicalism of the 1860s that starts with the elections of 1863, which are responsible in many ways for Proudhon's de la capacité politique des classes ouvrières, but also contribute in many respects to the creation of the IWMA in France. You have the question of the Commune and the participation of Proudhonians in the Commune. Most of them were hostile. And you have after the Commune, when actually you have a republic in France, and then how do people interpret Proudhon after you actually have a republic and no longer an empire? And then I guess, as a last point, what are the ideological stakes here? And I think that in this case, I brought up the case of James Guillaume, who oftentimes sort of slavishly followed Bakunin in trying to sort of be a good propagandist, and sort of freed from the master in 1911, he wrote an article which might seem kind of risible, called Proudhon communiste, in which he suggested that Proudhon was a communiste sans le savoir, But he did that for very interesting reasons, partly because at the time he was very much interested in revolutionary syndicalism, and I think that Marc Villemier's excellent introduction to Guillaume's memoirs goes over this, and I think he's also written an article about this relationship between Guillaume and revolutionary syndicalism in the early 20th century. A couple years later, after suggesting that Marx and Proudhon had a lot more in common than one might otherwise thought, Guillaume, of course, wrote a book called Karl Marx Pan-Germaniste, and this was after the beginning of the First World War, and that suggests, in many respects, the extent to which the interpretations of this experience of the IWMA and the various ideas at stake in the 1860s and 70s was very much dependent on the context in which people were making the argument that these things were important.
Thank you very much.